just very quickly about the book itself. There's an astrophysicist called Neil deGrasse Tyson who once said, "Science literacy is vaccine against charlatans who would exploit your ignorance of the forces of nature." Is that what this book is, then, a vaccine for children?
I like to think it was a vaccine against charlatans of all kinds. It does it in, I hope, a fairly subtle way, however. The idea is to present the science and to let the science speak for itself and to make the science so exciting and so thrilling that the children will indeed be vaccinated against charlatans of all kinds, as Dr. deGrasse Tyson said.
And now to the scope of the explanation, because evolution essentially it's a huge idea in that it explains all life on this planet. Now, would we expect to see a similar mechanism operating on another planet?
It's a fascinating question. I would put my shirt on the answer to that question being yes. If you look through history on this planet at all the ideas that have ever been suggested for how life comes to be here, there's only one that even could work. Any alternatives that have been thought of, that have been suggested, in principle, are not big enough explanations, not good enough explanations to do the job of explaining life on this planet. And my conjecture would be that there probably is not an alternative to Darwinian natural selection. The only other alternative known to me, which in principle you might think would work, is Lamarckian evolution, which uses the idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. That's to say, for example, when your muscles grow as a result of plenty of exercise, you then pass on the big muscles to your children. And that has been suggested as a way in which evolution might work. But I've argued that even if acquired characteristics were inherited, which they're not on this planet, by the way, but even if there were another planet where acquired characteristics were inherited, then that would not in principle be a powerful enough explanation to give rise to all of life. I could go into that more, but I suspect you have other questions.
Guess we made more questions. Look at them. Again, though, just looking at the scope of it, how do we find these planets? How do we know they exist? Are we just guessing at this stage?
Well, this is of course a vitally important question, and until fairly recently, there was no direct evidence that any other stars in the universe were orbited by planets. And so it was open to people to say, maybe we're the only life form in the universe because we're the only sun that has planets. Well, that we certainly can now disprove. The evidence is now very strong that most of the stars that have been looked at by improved methods have turned out to have planets. We know this because, I think I won't go into detail about that unless you want me to, but it's now, the tally is many hundreds of stars have now been looked at with techniques powerful enough to detect whether they have planets, and the majority of them have. And so if you extrapolate out to the universe as a whole, it looks as though about 10 to the 22 stars are out there with planets. Well, 10 to the 22 is, as you can imagine, a very large number, and in order to deny that there is life elsewhere, if you're one of those people who wants to suggest that we are unique, that we are alone in the universe, then what you're in effect saying is that we are the only planet out of 10 to the 22 who has life. If you think about what that means, it means that the origin of life on this planet was a stupefyingly, staggeringly improbable event. So improbable, 1 in 10 to the 22, so improbable that any attempt to work out a good theory for how it happened on this planet is totally wasting our time. What we're looking for, if you want to believe, as I don't, but if you want to believe that this is the only planet in the universe that has life, then you are specifically not looking for a plausible theory of the origin of life on this planet. You're looking for a staggeringly implausible theory, because if you find a plausible theory, then the universe must be crawling with life, teeming with life. And I suspect that it probably is, because I don't believe that life originated on this planet in this act of stupefying improbability. So I think there probably are billions of life forms dotted around the universe. But even if there's a billion life forms in the universe, that's still extremely rare compared to the total number of stars. And so those little islands of life might be so spaced out from each other that they never have any chance of encountering one another, a sort of celestial Polynesia without the canoes going between them. If we are ever visited by life forms from elsewhere, it is highly, highly unlikely to be bodily. It's much, much more likely to be radio, because radio waves propagate outwards in all directions as an ever-expanding sphere, and therefore there's an enormously greater chance that the radio waves will encounter another planet that has life. If you think about the way bodies propagate themselves, they don't radiate outwards in all directions. They go in only one direction at a time. And so I would be hugely surprised if we ever had witnessed a touchdown by a flying saucer. I would not be so surprised if we detected radio transmissions from elsewhere. That's why I think that it's worth spending money on the SETI project, which is the search for extraterrestrial intelligence using radio telescopes. That, I think, is a worthwhile enterprise, because the first contact of life from another planet will almost certainly be by radio, not by direct contact.
You mentioned the SETI project, and there's Carl Sagan's book, which was a work of fiction called Contact. And in that, again, it works on the basis of a radio transmission. And humanity has to select ambassadors to represent the best of our species when they do eventually meet the aliens. Who would you all say top 3 human ambassadors? Living or dead?
Living or dead? Well, one of them's got to be Charles Darwin, hasn't it? I would say Carl Sagan himself, actually. Carl Sagan had a chapter in one of his books, which I think is called Who Speaks for Earth? And so it's really asking the same question. So that would be my first 2. I think for the third, I'd let the audience decide.
I would put Douglas Adams.
Albert Einstein, good one, yes, okay.
Or Douglas Adams. I think I would put Douglas Adams.
Douglas Adams, that's a nice and interesting thought. Yes, maybe we could have more than 3. Somebody suggested that what we should do is broadcast out into outer space the complete works of Johann Sebastian Bach, but that would be boasting.
I'd like to very quickly take a quick detour into art for a moment. If you look at the relationship that religion has with art, as against the relationship that science has with art, religion has commissioned essentially great works. So Pope Julius II woke up one morning and thought, ceiling's looking bare, get that man Michelangelo in here, make him do something. Has science done that? Does it do that? Should it do that?
It is an interesting point, isn't it, that people often say, oh, well, we have to thank religion for great works of art, for the Sistine Chapel ceiling, for the B minor Mass, for the Messiah. And that is a fair point, except exactly to the point you just made, that that's where the money is, and artists have to live. And so they tend to go where the commissions are. And we shall never know what Haydn's Evolution Oratorio might have been like, or Beethoven's Mesozoic Symphony, or something. I mean, the inspiration might have been even greater.
I'm wondering about now, actually. I mean, we seem to be in a good time now for science writing, for atheism. This event, for instance, was, I think, the fastest one to sell out at the festival. And this gentleman is a scientist. So there is a lot of interest amongst audiences, amongst readers. I'm wondering if we might see that in the future. I mean, is the Richard Dawkins Foundation going to commission someone to build a large scale?
Well, the Richard Dawkins Foundation is admirable in many ways, but wealth is not one of them. if we ever did raise a very large amount of money, that would be a wonderful thing to do, yes.
I'd like to talk about imagination. Again, trying to compare the take that how religion uses imagination and how science uses imagination. So religion and superstitious, they have a really easy free rein on that. You can make stuff up and then no one gets to question about it. How important is imagination in the work of a scientist?
Imagination plays an enormously important part in the work of a scientist. Karl Popper distinguished two phases, the conjecture phase where you use your imagination. It's rather like a work of art, and you think freely, and then you test it against experiment. Or observation. But even in the imaginative phase, science is disciplined. It doesn't allow imagination to just have absolute free rein in a totally mad way. And you can see some bad scientists who simply let their imagination sort of run off at the mouth, drivel away, rather than being disciplined, circumscribed by the need to stick to reality. And so someone like Einstein, who had one of the greatest imaginations ever, came to what he did by imagining certain particular changes in the worldview that we all had at the time. And these were, once he allowed himself to the freedom to postulate this revolutionary idea that the speed of light is constant and then you fit everything else around that, he then came up with this astonishing mental leap. Darwin denied the role of the imagination, wrongly actually, I think. Darwin said of himself that he seemed to have become just a machine for grinding facts out into theories, and that's not the way Darwin or anybody else worked. Darwin, like any other good scientist, had theories which he then tested. They would have been sort of inspired by the facts, and it's notable that this great idea, evolution by natural selection, which in principle could have occurred to anybody in an armchair, any time from Aristotle onwards, didn't occur to anybody until the middle of the 19th century. And when it did occur to anybody in the middle of the 19th century, it occurred to two traveling naturalists who were inspired by going to the tropics, going to tropical jungles specifically, and looking at the astonishing diversity of life that they found. So once again, the imagination is fired, stimulated, and I suppose somewhat circumscribed by reality.
And then you also get bad cases like Mr. Ernst Haeckel. He had some very peculiar ideas, but then also his imagination led him, I think, to discover Java Man, which was...
no, Haeckel didn't discover Java Man. That was...
to find it or something.
Eugene Dubois, I think, discovered Java Man. And actually was convinced that Asia was the place to look for human origins. Contrary to Darwin, who, without knowing any, there weren't any fossils at the time, and Darwin conjectured that the place to look for human origins was actually Africa. And he did that on the basis of comparative observations, comparing humans to the other great apes, and noting that we're more like chimpanzees and gorillas than we're like orangutans or gibbons. And so Darwin would have sent people off to Africa to look for fossils, whereas Dubois thought he should go to East Asia. And he found Java Man, which is relatively recent. I mean, that's Homo erectus, which is not that old. Africa is the place to look for really old human fossils. And now, of course, they've been found in abundance.
Can we talk about toolkits? The toolkits of religion and the toolkits of science. Religion, I think, it has a sort of a toolkit with three tools in it. One is, as you've mentioned, I think in The Devil's Chaplain, tradition, revelation, and authority. Those tend to be the tools that you work with. What are the tools that science equips you with, or what should it equip kids with in particular?
Well, authority, revelation, and tradition hardly deserve the title of tools at all. I mean, they're not going to lead you to the truth in any sensible way whatever. I suppose the tools of science would be imagination, as I've just said, experiment, observation, systematic observation, logic, statistics. Don't be fooled by patterns that you think are there. instead use objective methods to decide whether the patterns really are there, because the human mind is extremely easily fooled and thinks there are patterns when there aren't any, and the reverse, fails to see patterns when there are. And I think statistics is a very underrated tool of science. Another important one is systematically trying to avoid your own biases. It's extremely hard for a scientist to rid herself of the contamination of prior conviction. And this has become extremely important in medical science, where the double-blind controlled experiment has become the proper way to test whether some drug or some treatment works. If you believe that such and such a drug is going to work to cure some disease, it's vitally important that when you do the experimental tests, neither the patient, nor the experimenter, nor the doctor who assesses the results knows which is the control and which is the experiment. And this has only fairly recently been realized. And so now, when new drugs are tested, they're always done, if the science is decent taught, they're always done by the double-blind method, where the control dose and the experimental dose are labeled just with letters of the alphabet. You don't know. Nobody knows. It's locked up in a safe or in a computer. Which of them is the control dose and which of them is the experimental dose? If it's not locked up in a computer, it's always open to the complaint that with the best will in the world, the scientist is going to be biased by knowing what the result that he expects to get is, even biased against it, possibly. He may be so scrupulous that he's even biased against his hypothesis. You don't want bias at all. So that's a very important technique. Repetition of results. If a result is controversial, if it's important, if it's going to revolutionize science, then it's not good enough to have one experiment that tends to show the result. It has to be repeated. And revolutionary or controversial results are always repeated in different labs in different parts of the world. And it's one of the fundamental principles of science that if it's really true, then it doesn't matter if you do the experiment in America or Sri Lanka or Japan, you'll get the same result if you do the work properly.
When you were a little boy, and it would have taken many years for you to come to the idea of evolution in books or in stories or in conversation, kids who are growing up now have a much easier time with it. There's more access to that kind of idea, it's more in the popular consciousness. What do you expect to see come from that, the idea that everyone is used to it, that we're getting to grips with those concepts early on?
I suppose one of the main cultural innovations is the internet, and the fact that children especially have not just access, but maybe even overdose of access to the world of knowledge in the form of the internet, Wikipedia. You could look things up at will instantaneously almost. So that I think is a really, really big change from my childhood. And I think that one of the encouraging things is the way Moore's law, which states that computer power increases exponentially, still seems to be true, although nobody quite understands why. Means that computers are getting cheaper and more powerful, and are becoming, instead of being rich people's toys, are already available to many, many people who are not rich. And that's going to increase and increase and increase. And that, I think, is a very encouraging thought.
I was thinking also about, again, children now have almost a choice of what to learn. It's not just that indoctrination of religion. There is an alternative, which, I certainly didn't have. And I think maybe children now are the first generation to really have that. Do you think that's going to cause...
I think one of the great evils of the world is childhood indoctrination. And the thought, it starts when children, and all society accepts this, it starts when we label children with the beliefs of their parents. It should be an outrage for anybody to say